The Tender Witch. Chapter 2. The Town of North End. I have always thought North End to be a humdrum kind of place. The further inwards a person trod, it's true they could find something of interest. The Academy, a mere 2 brick buildings cramped amidst townhouses, hosted a group of youth, the liveliest of the town only thanks to their age and able joints. The market around the town's stagnant fountain was no place for vast gatherings, since there weren't enough people for that. The chapel, for vigilance and the Speakers' Guild, was settled near the public park, a patch of grass designated because the buildings did not happen to spring up there, and its belfry towered only arms taller than the tallest buildings. Since all things in North End were rather smallish, the people of North End, the great majority, came into town, as I often did, only when they required a touch of civilization to furnish their bread baskets and soap boxes, to buy their yarn and weavings and shoe repairs, perhaps a ticking clock, if one had saved their slims. But they did not venture to make nice, beyond the fences of their dairy fields, the roaming of their sheep, or the space beyond which their chickens did not pass, which may have been the dirt leading to the road, unless, of course, they were to meet and make nice with a friend, those people to share dinner and goods with, when the winter months made living rougher. They especially did not make nice, nor look my way, unless I had bothered to raise my eyes from my shy-footed steps to look at them, in which case I may be spat at, or cursed quietly, or stared at outright. It was never truly violent, but they did not trust me, this I knew. For all of their disinterest in the rest of the world outside of North End, they unquestionably did not like the look of me, though I had never lived anywhere besides. And perhaps it bothered me more, because they did not look at my face, my lightish curling hair, which was much like my father's or anyone else's, or the funny way I happened to walk with my head cocked up into the side, as if I was constantly pondering things about the town and the townspeople and what they must have been doing cooped in their houses for the past winter months, although I admit I was usually pondering such boring things. Perhaps they glared at something as simple as my mother's ring, the one article I never failed to don. It was a token of her nearness, a curious cameo backed by a hoop of silver and polished by my constant twisting of it. No, they looked into something deeper, into the parts of me which were not my own to control or change. They despised the fact that I was my mother's daughter, and my mother was, since she moved here to join my father from her home near the southern forests, vilified to be one of those dark characters one encounters in child's harvest rhymes, one of those snatching hags of nightmarish proportions, who draw curses from the land and plague its people, an enemy of humankind by all accounts. When things went missing, people, or wits, or luck, it was the work of the North End snatching hag. Such an unfortunate strand of rumors had followed me as far into the past as I could remember. It is sad, but I was glad for morning walks, when the roads were near empty, and a handful of the street lamps had yet to be doused. It was better to be alone. Down the block, I saw the carved sign for the Stony Toad Tavern hung from 2 chains. Coming upon the entryway and the still glowing night lantern, I unlatched the double door with a mustering of effort. All looked dim and cold inside, except for 2 solitary figures by the corner windows, with their own papers and satchels, and each with a mug of steaming something. A blazing fireplace occupied the center of the room, and on its mantel was a carved icon of vigilance, a black anchor shaped like a scale sinking under rolling waves. The centerpiece amongst many heavy tables and stone columns, its smokestack disappeared through the roof to warm the walls of the higher stories. I heard a distinct snoring rumble from above. "Oh, good morning, Eloise. What do you think you're doing here on your day off? Come in to see Ed." Stacy called from behind the bar, until the woman herself, with her wiry brown hair, appeared to relieve her arms of a pile of fresh bread. She grabbed me for a jovial hug, the warmth of the oven still stuck on her sleeves. She was one in town who would call me neighbor, and was happy enough to. Her husband, Hobart, a mountain of a man, who was usually here on these early mornings, was not that day, it seemed. Stacy McCree had been in my life a long while. Beyond knowing me as a child, I'd worked under her at the Stony Toad for near a decade. Stacy knew of my mother as a kind woman, if only odd, and had taken me in some months before she decidedly trusted me to live on my own without throwing myself into the ocean. I did not take the news of my parents' deaths well. Not as well as anyone in town expected, but it was her mother's duty, as she was inclined to say. She often said I used to be flighty, unmanageable, overly emotional, and attached to silly things like wayward critters or weeds by the roadside, with a mind too strange and subject to seeing fanciful things where they did not exist. I imagined she believed she could curb my eccentric younger self into something less capable of becoming the town's fool. Too, she described the untimely guardianship as her second chance, as Providence awarded her by vigilance. She had just lost her first child, and was pawing to love a thing left unloved. And until she'd had Edgar, it was I who would be the receiver of her guidance, her love, and her wrath. Although Stacy was a dutiful neighbor in my upbringing after my parents passed, a child does not forget a person, even in all of their good intentions, who wants to change everything about them to the end of achieving normalcy. However, I could not contest her font of patience and empathy, or the fact that all of the work I did at the tavern allowed me to keep my parents' house during all those years without them. For that I would forever be in her debt, and that is precisely how I felt about the relationship. I was sorely indebted. I was sure that if I even proposed my going away to respond to the ridiculous letter, she would insist on my staying, for who else could she trust to do the work of cleaning without pause or complaint? Good morning, Stacy. No, I'm not here for Ed. Well, what can I be helping you with today, dear, on your day off? How's the day treating you? I thought to come by and ask how you would manage if I were gone for the week. If I happened to be headed away from town, silly thought of mine. I wouldn't expect to be gone long, but I sighed. Something urgent has found its way to my door. I would have said it's pointless, really, and I'm determined to decline the summons of the letter. But Stacy had a quick tongue. Gone? Where in North End does a person have to go? And on such short notice? Not too considerate to go wandering off. Winter may be melting, but I still need all the help I can find to keep the place warm. She placed her hands on her wide hips and looked me well over. It's no matter to me, Stacy, just a whim, a fool's endeavor, that's what it is. Can I help you with those? No, dear, Stacy said, returning to her bread. You don't worry your head about this or that. A little more notice, perhaps, if this comes up again. She raised a testing eyebrow as my jaw went slack. Again? I asked. Well, of course, you can have the time. You ought to have it. Take the time either way, no matter if you're out of town. You've never asked a day off before, and you look like you could use it. You've got bags, Eloise, right there under your eye. Shame it is to see a young lady like you in such a state, and so many sighs. Always so many sighs. I'll have to send for Emily to see if that frazzled girl can take the work. If not, there's not much harm done. The winter seems to drive the people from town, if I think of it honestly. Dear, I'm sorry if I sound worn down. No, you've a sweet heart. Thank you, Stacy. I swallowed. You're too generous to a pest like me. Aren't I just? But she smiled. It was her way with me, her misfit child. Truly, I mumbled, though Stacy insisted I speak loudly and clearly. Well, what was I to do now? Fill my empty days wandering around the house? Ration the groceries, as I'd be losing a week of work? Never in all my years had Stacy been so willing to tell me away, precisely the reason I'd never asked. My heart perked up at the possibility, but I forced it to quiet. there would be no frivolous going away. "My wee boy Edgar has been missing you, you know," Stacy said, shaking her head. "He hopes every day you'll come to visit. Perhaps when you have a moment you come by. Poor thing's getting over the winter shivers. His father's been up with him day and night while I'm here. Doc says he might lose his senses after this bout. I don't know what to do with myself, seeing a precious babe like him all stuffed with coughs. I'm sorry I haven't made the time. I could read to him whenever you like, watch him for a spell." Stacy's eyes held mine at the word, but she turned back to the kitchen, waving her hand, and did not bother me about it. "Yes, it would be good to have Hobart back down here if you'd watch the boy. If we're in luck, Edgar won't be sick for much longer. He's my strong lad." And then she looked at me, a civil stare, before returning to her breads and her kitchen. "I know how this time of year must be for you. If I see the speakers scowling at you again during their memorial of all things, bless my heart, by vigilance, I'll give them a stern one, I will. You've been so good about keeping to yourself. I don't see why they need bother you about any more incidents, as if a young lady like you could be responsible for every misfortune of the town. And with the final hunt so praised, good news like that, it's unthinkable. That Mad Maury was bound to take his tumble into the sea eventually. He'd been raving about it for years. There's no reason to start pointing fingers about a simple accident." Her eyebrows jumped when she spoke, her arms too burdened with pantry goods. "Stacy, you're too much. I'll be fine on my own." I desperately hoped she wouldn't say a word to confront them. Trouble with any of the guilds was a thing so unnecessary and horribly complicating. There were no keepers of vigilance's truths in our small town, or seekers of heritage, but the speakers, the most common of the three, could call on the others if they thought it necessary. I imagined it was a small thread I need trip over to incite inquiries as to whether hags, and a fear of them, were indeed mere shades in the history of North End. "Like I said," she went on, prying to read past my evasive simper, "you know we're here for you if you need us. My family is your family. Now, are you off on errands today? I won't keep you, girl." And she went on into the tavern's kitchen and left me in the empty hall to let myself out. I left the stony toad and relieved my sighs into the morning air as a moan of thunder broke out in the distance. I knew I was lucky she hadn't pushed to know why a disturbed young woman wanted to leave town on her own. Not that I wanted to, but now it seemed I had the time. And I knew it was incredulous of me to be so intrigued by the letter, and certainly out of my character to entertain, but nothing of intrigue ever happened. And then the ticket would have been a shameful waste with no one to act on its behalf, wouldn't it? Perhaps that's what I was telling myself. Stacy was always telling me I ought to leave my house for more than work and errands, and she'd been saying that as long as she'd declared herself my caretaker. A grueling long while. Perhaps I would go, and there really was no harm in it, in breathing the air of the world outside of North End. Still, my inclination was to reserve 1 day for fixing the windmill, 1 day for painting, and 5 more days to do nothing at all. The Kershaw's family bakery was further down the streets, one of the oldest buildings in town still standing, long passed down. Darren Kershaw had spent his short lifetime there providing bread enough for everyone in North End who didn't want to attempt baking their own. Nothing compared to the Kershaws. On this the town was agreed. I walked deeper into town on the side of the road. I was most comfortable there and out of the way. Some of the early day crowd in the market were pitching stalls under thatched blankets. The street lamps here were bare and cold, and fog settled on the tops of the roofs. The recesses of the apartment windows, the few windows belonging to folks who had no hand at shepherding, were dark. Couples of people wandered the marketplace, some sitting with their backs on the fountain wall, while others looked intently to buy up road hay in their rickety 2-wheeled carts before the later morning weather could spoil them on their trip back to the barn lofts. I stopped for what vegetables my mother's garden could not provide, and avoided staying long in the presence of those who did not want me around their crops. Vigilance forbid I curse them with maggots or flies, or something like that. I could see the bakery's twin chimney stacks puffing across the way, their smoke mingling with the low-hanging mist, and headed straight for the entrance with my head down. A plop of rain landed on my hat just before I'd reached the door's awning. The room was warm with the wafting smells of butter and sugar. Darren had some glass cases close to the windows for his prettier creations, sweet rolls and frosted pastries, with berry centers neatly lined on a wax paper roll with lacy trim. His more routine bread loaves were baked in intricate knots and braids, lying patient in high baskets upon the wall shelves. The tinkle of the bell above the door gave away my entrance, and Darren appeared from his oven room sporting his usual cordiality alongside the flour on his rolled sleeves and apron. He turned his eyes to me, stopped, and threw his hands up with a laugh. He was another neighbor of mine, and there is where the list grew falteringly short. "Morning, Lou. What a pleasure to see you of all people." He rounded the counter to shake my hand, stepping past his younger brother Nathan at the register. Nathan was admittedly demure and not fond of talk or greetings, but I hadn't forgotten to notice his equally kind smile upon opening the door. Personally, I preferred to keep words short, even with those familiar to me. It meant less time to fumble on my own and say something absurd. This was one opinion of Stacy's which had stuck to me as sure as a leech. I could not fault her. She was right. I'd been known to speak nonsense. Good morning, Darren. I've come for 5 Slims worth and some grains for the birds if you have any. I think I've come ahead of your busy hours." "You know your company is welcome any time, please, and anything you need," Darren said. He looked at me eagerly as I picked out a small sourdough loaf and soft potato bread. Darren was 5 years my senior, but still had a childish air to him, and an insistent nature, and eyes to match. Here was one person who did not ever seem to mind my company. He rather seemed to enjoy me. It was a relief from my usual experience to have someone lend me their kindness. "I always get your sourdoughs. Have you anything new from the oven?" "Of all the people in the world, Lou, it's like you see right through me." He tapped his forehead. "I've been working on something just this last week. Do you think you're brave enough to partake?" "I'll just be a moment. Close your eyes. Nate, don't let her peek a wink." And Darren went skipping back to the kitchen as I organized my share of bread on the counter. He was gone before I could agree with or deny his excitement, and few could find the time to deny Darren before his excitement was upon them. "I'm sorry, Miss Eloise," Nathan mumbled, half smiling. "He's just been so inspired lately, ever since you came last week and bought those violet cakes. He's been trying for something better. Whatever's in his head, I know he loves how you humor him." "There's little a person may do to quell his enthusiasm. I don't think I have the heart to tell him he's surely demanding." "Perhaps that's why he takes to you so. You don't mind him so much." Nathan rang me up for the bread, the decisive clang of the register tinging throughout the room. I raised a quizzical brow, not exceptionally perceptive when it came to Darren and his antics. After a rummaging through his icebox, Darren emerged from the kitchen with both hands cupping something precious behind his back. As expected, the unending enthusiasm alight on his face was infectious, and my usual neutrality turned to a modest smile. He motioned me to close my eyes, and I did so, amused for the moment, as I held out my hand. He sat a crackling bit of wax paper in my palm. "Go on," he said. "Don't hold back. I want honest opinions." With my free hand, I felt at a sticky, crumbly mess of what I thought to be cake and lifted a piece to my mouth. The immediate tartness overwhelmed my cheeks, and I opened my eyes to see Nathan stifling a laugh at my bunched-up nose. Darren sat on the brink of disappointment before I nodded at Nathan's delight, mouth too full of cake for words. Darren relaxed his clasped hands. "Say you like it, Lou." "Is this lemon?" I took another bit from the paper, seeing now how the lemon curd stuck to everything it touched. Yes, Darren looked contentedly at his brother. I wanted to indulge the town in something other than ryes and whiskeys. It's really very good, I said. I promptly wrapped the rest of the cake up and placed it on the counter. It was a habit of mine to feel that my presence was objectionable after so many minutes, even if the Kershaws, like Stacy, did not mind me. If you have more of it, I'll gladly buy a 1/4 pound, but I must be on my way before the rain falls, you see. My dear Lou, I'll gladly give you the first week's worth if you agree to never ever cease with that hilarious face of yours. I swatted at him as he laughed his way back to the kitchen. Nathan apologetically grinned, packing the breads into my bag. Please let me pay you too, I said, for the sweets. I can afford it, Nathan. I know Darren wants to have that new oven put in. Miss Eloise, we don't get the pleasure of seeing your face but once or twice a week. Darren will never regret giving you more than your share. He thinks highly of you. I sighed to accept the gift, another debt to tally. But suddenly I found myself contemplative of the meaning Nathan's words carried. Not many would admit to thinking of me, not highly of all words. I took my change with a barren expression. Over the past months, I thought Darren had become less himself. But I didn't know what this new change was. His eyes couldn't sit still when they looked at my face. They wandered. They were curious. To think of it, his excitement was no longer boundless, but seemed to swell with my presence and ebb the moment he turned away. I was unprepared for the change in him. Darren came once again from the back room, holding a delicate box with a powder blue bow tied around the lid, and a smallish sack of grains for the birds in my meadow. The box I thought much too flamboyant for me. He should have saved it for some other prim mother or maid looking for desserts, not my simple self. I knew it would only be repurposed to hold my perennial seeds and dry bulbs in the mudroom, and I'm sure he hoped it to hold ladies' jewelry. I owned none, but what I wore, which was my mother's ring, and her pearls if I was feeling like I wanted attention. But that was the last thing I could ever hope to want. He extended a hand and held me close for a brief and uncomfortable moment before packing the extra gifts into my bag. His hands were hot. From my side, Darren waved Nathan to the ovens. Nate, you want to check on the next batch? We can take some of the heat off, let the rolls cool. I just have a word for Lou. Oh, of course. Nathan moved away from us, resuming his shyness in the kitchen. Lou, Darren began, bright eyes turning large and reluctant in the privacy of the room. His tender seizing of my hand grew tighter, and he clutched it in both of his like a trapped dove. Something about the gesture had me wishing someone, anyone, would open the bakery doors and interrupt whatever was about to happen. I want to know your thoughts of me. What do you mean? I was so unaware. I forced a smile, though my hand was cramped. Instinctually, I tried to pull away and make space between us, our unsettling closeness. Your thoughts, Lou. I'm suffering to know. You're a dear friend, a dear and special woman to me. Tell me you've noticed. You've begun to stop by to grace me with that meek smile of yours every other day, at least. The violet cakes, you inspired them, of course. Me? Inspire a cake? Like a hag inspires sympathy in a narrow-eyed crowd. I felt his speech was so rushed it had been rehearsed as lines of soliloquy. Each of them in sequence became a revelation of further irrationality. Darren, come, I don't know what you could mean. But he continued to speak over me, as if I had said nothing. Since you've finished your years at the academy, I know it has been a time, but still, you had mentioned once you thought you might think fondly of me. I do admit that as of late I've thought of your confession of love. He said it so matter-of-factly, like history, and implied with a subtle friskiness in his voice that it was clear the fact of my love was supposed to be gratifying to him. The word was so odd. And you can imagine I'd never heard it from a person who could not be my parent. It sat heavily on the tongue, and it didn't taste sweet as one may think it to, hearing it for the first time. Love? I love you and Nathan very much, of course. My hesitation oozed out in ripples. It was true, an inkling of it. I loved qualities of them, like how they never turned my business away and offered me recipes, and had on occasion invited me to visit for suppers, but I'd never actually visited. It wasn't my way. Well, perhaps this deal with Mrs. Langston could change that, my new habit of leaving the house. A trip to Floundering sounded most favorable at that precise moment. Anyway, as it was, I loved qualities of their persons, and unabashedly loved their breads, as everyone did, as every girl, woman, crone in town did. But this confession he mentioned was absolute farce. I mean, you may have loved me, Lou. How many times would you have me say it? And Lou, I know I haven't always seen eye to eye with you. The whole town thinks you as bizarre as you've ever been, and I'd be dishonest to say I didn't agree at points in my life, he chuckled. You were strange with your fancies years back, but you've grown out of that, I think. And I've grown over the years, I'd like to think, too. You're more than you once were. Darren, wait, please. Love is a silly word to toss around in a bread shop. I've been alone a very long time, Darren, and while I do take you for a friend, please understand. I would have said something like, years ago you were a buffoon come school seasons, and had laughed at me like the rest. Or, nowadays you make my bread at the turn of every week. Isn't that enough? There was no way I could forget the boy who threw smushed snails at my head for laughs. No matter how many times Stacy had him apologize, and no matter how many years he played at forgiveness. But Darren stopped my honest words, my light-hearted, turned troubled smile, with a hasty pressing of his lips to my hand. And there he held them. I could not misinterpret this. I felt his hot breath on my skin, on my bare wrist, the startling wetness of his thin lips. Shocked from speech, I felt my stomach turn and twist. My voice broke and split in two, one half a gasp, the other stuck and caught captive in my chest. Then I found the words, and in the moment I felt sure of them. I'm leaving town tomorrow, I let slip. Town? He raised his head, looking to me. He would have looked handsome, maybe, with his darker hair and strong brow, had he not been so simple in his doughy brain. I took the opportunity to retrieve my hand and wiped the unfounded kiss along my coat. What could you leave town for? Was I too quick, Lou? I've known you all along, all my life. It's just now that I've realized it. I do love you, I do. I'm not sure that's love. Don't imagine something horrid of me, Darren. It has nothing to do with you or anything you've done, honest. Though I desperately wanted to escape his attentions then, his mind must be too hot from his ovens. No one of sound mind would claim to love Eloise Wayward. Well, I wish it did have anything to do with me. What's made you want to leave? You hardly ever leave home, let alone town. I can give you a life. The world may be full of promise, but in one man, in me, I could be everything, give you everything you need. That's agreeable, isn't it? Was agreeable what people strove for nowadays? During this time, his expression was a whirling mix of certainty. He was naturally zealous, this was true. But this crossed the line into ignorance, arrogance. Just last month he was courting Miss Hannah, and before her it was Rosea, never mind Nora 2 springs before. Not that I cared to make notes on my own account, but he had taken the time to tell me so, how he was thus infatuated with them in their seasons. He was not a bad man, but I did not recognize him as a steady one. Still, he pressed me. Lou, consider it. There aren't many options out there, not in a town such as ours. You're a charm, I've said it. I have a wonderful feeling about this, about you. Be mine. He tried to take my hands again, but I turned from him to the counter and slung the bread bag on my forearm, tucking my hands around my chest to shield myself from his excited eyes. He was hardly dissuaded. I was more vexed than anything, and felt my chest rising with the fiery pressure of a kettle, as if I intended to consider marrying my once childhood harrier. He was kind now, but he was no saint. I wasn't either, according to the speakers, but I did not pretend at things as precious as love. I will consider it. And nothing more, I thought. Consider it, do. I didn't know how to approach you, but something about today felt special, you know. But because you look to be in a hurry, I wish you safe passage home. And think of me, won't you? That, and I don't trust Nate to keep my bread from burning. He leaned on the counter and began eating the rest of the lemon tart I had left behind. I don't know how you make that trek to town and back to that dingy cottage every day without losing your stockings to the wind and then some. You're one of a kind, my dear Lou. He winked, a sly and playful gesture, now that he had no hold of me, but I was not encouraged to unbind my arms and wave him good day. His recovery was astounding, already making jokes, and suddenly sounding more insensitive than I had ever had an ear to notice. My lips curved up in their awkward smile, but my eyes fell to check the scuffs on the tips of my boots. I do not think he could read my heart, for if he could, I did not discern it beyond his victorious grinning. It was a bold, to use a word, man, who mentioned a lady's stockings. But could he at least stop with that cosseting nickname? I believe he thought it was only a matter of time. Unfortunately for me, my ability to bake was abysmal. I wondered how many days I could go without bird's nest toast in the morning before having to return with a forthright consideration, or before he would demand one. The sooner I gave Darren a piece of my mind, and there was no questioning what that piece was, the sooner he could turn to Emily Bunstein at the tavern. Was it wishful to hope he'd forget this frail affection? Had I really given him, at any point in our friendship, the seed on which to grow this fancy? I frowned. I think not. Then, for the second time that day, leaving North End sounded much more like a possibility than it ever had. Thank you for your time, Darren. Nathan? I called to him beyond the kitchen door. Nathan poked his head through, looking first at Darren, then at me. But I felt he was more insightful than his brother, despite his lesser years. His slight smile turned somber, as if the look on my face was the snuff to his wick. It seemed he'd expected, as I had, that Darren would approach me with more gentility. I said a swift goodbye and turned to leave with my basket, and buttoned my coat high to my chin as I opened the door. Rain had begun to fall onto the shop overhangs and was pooling with a constant patter into street puddles. More people wandered the streets at this time, but their umbrellas hid the telling part of themselves. It was a street of strangers, shadows animating coats and trousers. As the door was swept shut by the wind, I heard Darren ask Nathan in a hushed voice if they ought to visit on the day of the memorial. It was a fair thought, but as ill-timed as it possibly could have been. Lucky the letter had chanced my way. I would not be there to see them, him, and their pitying glances, if I were happily in Mrs. Langston's parlor. Enough with pity. There aren't many options out there, he'd said. What an art of persuasion! As if he was so short of his own luck to consider marrying the cursed spinster girl of North End, with a hag for a mother, and a dead one at that. What familial love had once been mine I could not remember. No, marriage was not fated for me. Loneliness. Now there was the familiar tune. It was indiscernible from the sound of the rain, but I took to it far better than Darren's cooing. And the rain, at least, never failed to ease my mind of all the other noise. I drew my bag up and lifted my hood. These were gloomy streets. Water gathered on the market tents, and raindrops rinsed those crates of apples and apricots which were left out of cover. Unlike the winter gales, which tear apart barn roofs and carry away stray wagons, the spring rains fell heavy and were known to keep people contingent on their hearths. The market would be fairly deserted until the skies cleared. I could be gone home by then. I walked quickly and clung to the walls of the nearby houses with their boxed gardens and weeping bricks, until I reached Mr. Pavel's. In the few minutes it took me to turn the corners of several streets towards his shop, I was stopped by only one doleful greeting that day. Odd bird, that hag child, they had said. a wickedly young woman accompanying her aged mother up the steps of her apartment house, likely heading out of the rain after a morning stroll. It came as quiet as a whisper to me from across the street, but I did not need to lift my head to know it was not meant as any whisper, and they did not see any need to keep the comment to themselves. That was fine. There was no real harm in words I had surely heard before. A verdant door, adorned with a copper plate, led me inside to the shop of Mr. Rufus Pavel. It was a familiar and solitary shop at the edge of the alley in the street, always with a peaceful feeling inside, despite its stale air. There was a shade of dust all around, as there was little time for painting in a world born for progress, even in a no-name town as ours. The unpopularity of it suited me. Owner of the quaint art supply shop, Mr. Pavel peeked over his counter and stood slouched with his embossed cane. He greeted me gruffly before settling back onto his stool and diverting his solemn attentions to his needlepoint. It was just a grumbled hello, and I nodded politely before exploring his array of paints. Potted flowers hung from the rafters, as a kind of painter's inspiration, whenever I was at a loss for colors. On the wall were painter's brushes and paint jars in neat drawers, which contained the whole imaginable spectrum. All kinds of paints filled his drawers, from lacquers to mats, even wallpaper pastes for the person not at all interested in painting. But stacked discreetly in the back room, Mr. Pavel also had rows of stretched canvases of varying sizes. Too, there was a gold bird cage, centered in the shop window, by the thread spools, empty of any bird and half covered by a wool blanket. The cage had been empty for years, and one could guess not to ask him why. Mr. Pavel once had a bird in that cage, which his wife had brought from a town on the south side of the river, the place of her birth. The bird was black and broad-winged, with a hooded and intelligent face. Clara, Mr. Pavel called the bird, after his wife. I gladly picked up my favorite pastel blue and white, the likenesses I had emptied at home. I gently thanked him for his time as he drew up my cost and waved me away. Our conversations were limited, but civil. I did not often speak with him. Apparently, I had a depressingly hollow voice. When I first met him, holding the hand of my mother, as she searched for a 3-haired brush, and gave him my good morning, he had said, "What a wisp of a voice on this one, Heather. Greetings, little one. Clarabelle, come meet this creature." Clarabelle kept her graying hair tied about her head in a scarf, and a patchwork apron tied around her wide bosom. Whenever she entered the front room, the bird would call out to her in a mimic's voice. "My," Clarabelle said, and kneeled to greet me. "What a likeness! Say good morning for me, dearie." And I did so, just as my mother was picking up my father's fine oil paints from Mr. Pavel's back room. She loved the way the older folk revolved around me, her young one, and she was fond of Lady Clarabelle. She had emeralds for eyes, and loved her rings and bangles. "My," Clarabelle said again, "what a wonder of a babe you have, Heather. She looks like you. Pleased to meet you, little Eloise." And the bird would look at me and call from its perch by the window, "Eloise, Eloise." On our way home, Mr. Pavel said something you wouldn't hear in town. Not now. He was jollier then, had no reason for remorse. "Next time I see you, girl, I expect a bigger greetings. Agreed? Whispering greetings like that, people will think you're hiding curses in the corners of their shops. Isn't that right, Heather?" No, people did not say such things now. One did not mention curses so lightly, even with the hunts concluded and the hags gone. Mr. Pavel was a lonely man now. One could see it in his downcast eyes as I stepped through his door and back into the growing storm. I remember his wife Clarabelle had disappeared only weeks prior to my parents' deaths, just before the commencement of the last hunt. She'd wandered into the meadows during a fit of fever, trying to find her Clara bird, and was never found, neither her nor the goodly bird. The town blamed my mother with certainty from then onwards, said this was the final proof, that she'd bewitched the woman, given her a death curse, that she must be one of the hags responsible for the disappearances that plagued the countryside. But this Mr. Pavel did not believe. He was not charitable beyond his family, which was his Clarabelle. But he was not a superstitious man. Or if he was too tired to speak against my mother when the speakers called on him to invoke the formal hunt in North End. Still, I doubt he would be compelled to smile, to me if anyone, again. My errands then were done. How easily the day wasted away. I trained my eyes ahead to the cobbles leading out of town. Outside the streets of the neighborhood, the mist rose to the high cloud line, and the rain lost its downward decisiveness. It was a slow walk home with the moody blue clouds hanging pensively in the atmosphere, and my basket bundled under my coat. Frail flowers swayed beside the road and on the hills, but the usual scene made my heart ache in the cold. Tonight, I could pack. Tomorrow, I could go to the station. I hadn't traveled since before I'd had a mother and father, both to hold my hand. I wondered how flying would feel, and looked back to the sky, where the sun struggled to pry apart the highest cloud peaks. I could only hope this Mrs. Langston would be open to the idea of me in her house. But if she were friends with my mother, then it's likely she never knew me by the words snatcher, hag, or loon, since no sensible person made friends with a hag. I could be nothing in a new city, free of blame and the snide remarks of neighbors. I could choose to stay, to go. The latter excited me in a way I was not familiar. Any guiding words? I did not speak to vigilance as the rest of the world did, though the speakers claimed that such prayers were liberating. I think it was a feature of my being outcast. There was no one listening to accept me. No matter who I called to, nobody answered, not the wind nor the flowers. Another thundering roared in the distance from across the ocean, but no words of wisdom. At this age, I less expected a response than I did wholeheartedly exercise a disconcerting habit of talking to myself when no one was near. The world and every person in it made it clear that I had many odd habits. But still, one could hope. "Give me a sign," I whispered. I heard only a whistling response, as wind passed through the marine gulches and up the cliffs. "Tell me what to do." I lingered on the eastern horizon where the clouds began to break with the coming noon, and then, as my steps slowed and I brought my scarf up to cover my chin, a light appeared. Above the fading shape of the misty town was something strange, something hovering in the high clouds. The gulls had risen from the cliffs with the whistling. They sailed with the updrafts and drifted over the cobble road in the rainy drizzle. Their hazy shadows frisked across the grass, but with them was an enormous bird unlike any, purest white and glowing where the rains touched its broad wings. I blinked, and it was as if that briefest moment of blindness erased it from the world. It was gone, and the gulls dove back into the sea. I gave it a stray thought, and only a thought, before a crashing of thunder sounded nearer my ear than the last. The north wind pushed me along the path, as it is wont to do, towards home. The nearer I was to town, the less ease I felt. What would it feel like to leave it all behind me, even for a day? Did I dare dream of more? Over the ocean, the storm thundered again, but I would hear no more rain on the tin roof, and saw no more of any birds. The sound of sighs and fire were my only remaining company that day and night. I painted a while, and threw seeds around the yard for the droves of swallows. I brought in wood and drew water from the windmill's well for a bath. I thought of myself as an earthly creature, like a mole or badger. The world was all mystery to me, but here in my set, I had some sway over what was. The fire was mine, the books on their shelves, the chairs, the chores. If it must be someone's, The letter sitting alone, commanding the head of the table, must be mine too. My head flared with a constant throbbing to think of my dread decision. But I could do it. There was no harm in going. Should I stay here, there would only be that hoax of my father's memorial to attend, to show my respect to vigilance and the speakers of town, and Darren's wistful staring, and this news from Stacy of Mr. Morey's accident. That was no good for staying near town, not for me. This short-lived freedom I would choose for myself. I must go, then. At the close of the evening, I wandered upstairs, disturbingly aware of the empty dusk outside of my window. I packed what little of my life would fit into my father's old suitcase and my mother's bag, primarily an older knit sweater and socks enough to clothe me for several days if Mrs. Langston decided it better to turn me away after all. My coat rested in wait by the front door. There was a haunting silence during the night, as the storm laid itself to rest, with the sun far over the cheek of the ocean, and indigos enveloped the sky. The pale white blot of the sun bled into bruised shades, while the deep plum of outstanding clouds further sought to smother the light into a slumber. The fog washed over the mainland like dreams do, or how I wished they would on a sleepless night such as this. I drew the curtain over my bed to stifle the darkness, swearing for an instant that there were figures waiting on the road to abuse my windows with rocks. I locked the window and closed my bags with a lack determination. I wrapped the bed sheets around my face, tossing and bothered by nagging thoughts of proposals and unfortunate misunderstandings of who has and who hasn't died. The worst kind of misunderstanding, really. My mother's ring thought to pinch my finger, but I slept with it that night, to avoid any chance of leaving it behind. There was no rain to be my lullaby, no warmth but my own. I could only wonder what the bird had been. Was it another of my hallucinations, or the sign I had asked for? A full moon's light never made for ease of sleeping.